The image that opened this story still lingers. Mark Levin leaning forward with a practiced grin, and Jasmine Crockett meeting him with steady, unshaken eyes. That single exchange, his mockery, her quiet command, has already etched itself into the memory of millions. It was more than a debate. It was a reminder that knowledge speaks louder than insult, and that dignity never needs to shout. If that moment sparked something in you, it's because the lesson reaches far beyond one studio stage. Maybe you've stood in a classroom, a workplace, or a family gathering where someone tried to diminish your worth. Maybe you've been underestimated for your accent, your background, or simply for refusing to raise your voice. Crockett's response shows that preparation and principle can be the strongest answer. This channel is here for those stories, for every time you chose respect over rage, facts over noise. Share your own moments of standing tall in the comments. Your experience might be the spark that empowers someone else to hold their ground. And if you believe that voices of integrity deserve a bigger platform, help amplify them. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story of courage and clarity. Click the notification bell to stay connected. Like and share this video with friends who need a reminder that truth is still powerful. Because when we elevate those who meet arrogance with calm conviction, we strengthen the very foundation of our democracy. One debate, one voice, one choice to stay composed. That's how change begins. Subscribe, comment, and help amplify voices of integrity. Together, we can make sure that the next time someone tries to drown out truth with noise, the world will be ready to listen.
The gavel slammed like a gunshot, a single crack that silenced the restless murmur of the chamber. Cameras snapped toward the bench. Every seat was taken, every eye fixed on the tense line of figures at the front. Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her gaze steady and unflinching. Across from her, Justice Brett Kavanaugh shifted in his chair, a faint crease forming above his brow. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice even and deliberate, "I have just one question." The air seemed to contract. Journalists froze mid-note. A photographer's flash burst like lightning. Kavanaugh's confident half-smile faltered, almost imperceptibly, but enough for the room to notice. Gasps scattered like a ripple through water. A whisper raced across the gallery. What's she about to ask? And then, silence. Crockett's question cut through the chamber, sharp as a blade. The impact was instant. Some gasped aloud, others simply stared, mouths open, as if the floor had tilted beneath them. Kavanaugh blinked, once, twice. No answer came. Outside these walls, the moment detonated across the nation in real time. Phones lit up as clips hit social feeds within seconds. On X, one user wrote, "This is history, #Crockett mic drop." On TikTok, a teenager's reaction video racked up 1 million views in an hour. Cable networks interrupted programming with an urgent chyron. Crockett confronts Kavanaugh. Courtroom erupts. Commentators scrambled to replay the footage, analyzing every twitch of Kavanaugh's jaw, every unwavering second of Crockett's stare. Memes appeared before the hearing even recessed, side-by-side frames of the justice's stunned face and the words, "Just one question." But no one expected what came next. Because behind the headlines, behind the viral loops and trending tags, the stakes of this confrontation ran deeper than a single exchange. It wasn't merely a question. It was a challenge to years of power and precedent, a demand for accountability echoing far beyond marble walls. To understand why this single question shook the nation, why it resonated from campus dorms to kitchen tables, we need to rewind.
Before that single question thundered through the chamber, a storm had been building for years. The hearing itself was the culmination of months of public outrage, legal wrangling, and the quiet dread of a nation sensing that something fundamental was on trial. Not just a man in a robe, but the integrity of the system he represented. Washington was a city on edge, its marble corridors humming with rumor.
Outside the courthouse, protesters braved the chill, their signs a patchwork of urgency. Protect democracy, no one above the law, justice for all. The stakes could not have been higher. This was no routine oversight session. It was a rare public reckoning for a Supreme Court justice whose decisions had tilted the balance of American life, from voting rights to reproductive freedom. The clock was ticking on a series of cases poised to shape the country for generations. Each minute of testimony felt like sand slipping through an hourglass, the future narrowing with every grain. Inside, the atmosphere was a paradox of stillness and volatility. Senators exchanged terse whispers. Staffers clutched notes like lifelines. Every camera was trained on the long wooden table where Brett Kavanaugh sat, his reputation a fortress that had withstood past storms but now showed hairline cracks. Behind him, decades of precedent, Roe, Obergefell, the Voting Rights Act, loomed like ghostly witnesses. For millions watching from living rooms and subway platforms, this wasn't abstract politics, it was their lives. The right to cast a ballot without obstruction, the freedom to love openly, the assurance that the law would defend rather than diminish them. Immigrant families felt the tension in their bones. Communities of color recognized the stakes with ancestral clarity. Equality, long promised but unevenly delivered, seemed to balance on the edge of a knife. Representative Jasmine Crockett understood that fragility. Her own story was braided with the struggles of those who came before, parents who taught her that truth is both shield and sword, constituents who entrusted her to speak when silence felt safer. She arrived that morning knowing the weight of every voice she carried, every hope pinned to her presence. The hearing's urgency wasn't only about policy, it was about time. Court terms end, elections loom, and rights once lost are not easily reclaimed. As the minutes bled away, each question mattered more than the last. Observers sensed it, leaning forward as if proximity could slow the inevitable. Then came the subtle signals that history was coiling to strike. Crockett flipped to a fresh page of notes, the scratch of her pen loud in the hush. A senator checked the clock, his jaw tightening. Across the nation, feeds refreshed and notifications pinged as if the collective pulse quickened. What no one yet knew was that the next 30 seconds would rewrite the hearing's history. It wasn't a grand speech or a stack of documents that would tilt the room, but a single, carefully chosen question, one that cut through layers of legalese and political theater to pierce the heart of accountability. And when it landed, the echo would travel far beyond these walls, testing the strength of democracy itself. The country was about to see whether truth could still command silence from power, and whether the promise of justice could stand when challenged in its own house.
Brett Kavanaugh's ascent through the American legal hierarchy was less a steady climb than a series of well-timed leaps, each propelled by powerful patrons and an unshakable belief in his own inevitability. Born into privilege on the outskirts of Washington, he grew up with the city's political pulse in his ears and a clear map to influence etched before he could drive. At Yale, he sharpened his arguments like blades, winning debate trophies and allies who would later occupy corner offices and cabinet seats. Professors described a mind that thrived on confrontation, a student who could dazzle with precedent while quietly bending rules to his advantage. After law school, he moved effortlessly into the sanctum of Republican power, clerking for judges who prized loyalty as much as brilliance. By the late 1990s, he was embedded in the independent counsel's office investigating President Clinton, a young lawyer with a taste for headline-making fights. Colleagues remember the cool confidence, the tidy suits, the certainty that every legal skirmish was a contest to be conquered. Even then, whispers followed him, a talent for pushing boundaries, for framing facts so forcefully they left no room for dissent. When George W. Bush entered the White House, Kavanaugh was already there, a trusted operative who blended legal precision with political instinct. He helped vet judicial nominees and draft policies that expanded executive power, earning a reputation as the golden boy of conservative jurisprudence. Yet each promotion carried a faint echo of controversy. Critics noted how seamlessly he shifted positions when it suited his patrons, how his written opinions often cloaked ideology in meticulous footnotes. He wore confidence like a robe, but cracks were showing. Those fissures widened during his own confirmation to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Democrats questioned his role in shaping torture memos and surveillance programs. Kavanaugh deflected with a practiced calm, insisting he had only been a bystander. Behind closed doors, however, staffers recalled a man quick to anger when challenged, a jurist whose genial smile masked a will of iron. Then came the Supreme Court nomination, a pinnacle that turned every shadow of his past into front-page news. Old classmates resurfaced with unsettling stories of hard drinking nights and sudden rages. Allegations of sexual misconduct ignited a national reckoning, filling the Senate hearing room with the voices of women who demanded to be heard. Millions watched as he responded not with measured denial, but with searing indignation, pounding the table and glaring at senators as if daring them to doubt him. To supporters, it was righteous fury. To critics, it was a glimpse of entitlement laid bare. Despite the uproar, the votes fell his way. The gavel came down, and Brett Kavanaugh claimed a lifetime seat on the highest court in the land. For a time, it seemed his confidence had triumphed. He settled into the black robes of the Supreme Court with the poise of a man who believed the storm had passed. His opinions followed a familiar pattern: eloquent citations of precedent that subtly advanced a hard-line agenda on voting rights, reproductive freedom, and corporate power. Yet the dissonance never disappeared. Leaks from former clerks painted a portrait of a justice obsessed with image, privately volatile when rulings didn't bend his way. Investigative journalists uncovered financial entanglements and lingering questions about his confirmation testimony. Public trust in the court eroded as decisions on fundamental freedoms broke sharply along partisan lines. Still, Kavanaugh projected an air of unassailable authority. He attended elite gatherings, smiled for carefully staged photographs, and spoke of the court as a neutral guardian of the Constitution. But behind that polished facade, the pressure mounted. Every term brought fresh controversies: gerrymandering cases that undermined voting rights, rulings that chipped away at the separation of church and state, decisions that critics argued placed ideology above impartial justice. By the time Representative Jasmine Crockett entered the scene, the stage was set. The justice who once strode through hearings with impervious certainty now carried the weight of 1,000 quiet doubts. His confidence remained his armor, but the metal had thinned. Each new revelation left hairline fractures that no speech could seal. Observers sensed it even before the hearing began: the restless shifting in his chair, the flicker of irritation when questioned by junior members of Congress, the quick defensive smile that never reached his eyes. Power still cloaked him, but the seams were loosening. And on this day, before the nation, before the cameras, those cracks would widen. The question Jasmine Crockett was about to ask would find its way through every gap in that carefully constructed facade, striking at the core of the narrative Brett Kavanaugh had spent a lifetime crafting. The downfall had not yet arrived, but the echo of its approach could already be heard, a low rumble beneath the marble floor, promising that the silence to come would be deafening.
Jasmine Crockett's story begins far from the marble corridors of Washington, in a modest Dallas neighborhood where cicadas sang over cracked sidewalks and possibilities shimmered like heat on asphalt. Her parents, both first-generation college graduates, taught her that progress was never handed down. It was wrestled into existence, often by those who had been told to stay quiet. Her mother, a public school teacher with roots in a sharecropping family, carried the history of Jim Crow in her bones.
Her father, a postal worker whose grandparents fled racial violence in the Deep South, reminded her daily that survival and dignity were acts of defiance. As a child, Jasmine absorbed their lessons at the dinner table, where conversations ranged from the civil rights marches of the 1960s to the fresh headlines of immigrant struggles. She listened to her grandmother recount the long bus rides to segregated schools, the poll taxes that once denied her the right to vote, the quiet heroism of neighbors who refused to be erased. Those stories settled deep, shaping a worldview rooted in service and an unshakable belief that justice must be lived, not just promised. Education became her first battlefield. In classrooms where expectations for black girls were often suffocatingly low, Jasmine insisted on excellence, not for applause, but for survival. Teachers remember her as the student who stayed after the bell, hungry for debate and unafraid to question authority. Scholarships carried her to the University of Houston and later to law school, where she cut her teeth in the intense arena of criminal defense. While some classmates angled for corporate firms, Jasmine chose the cramped offices of public defenders, representing clients who could barely afford bus fare. Those years were trial by fire. She faced judges who dismissed her, prosecutors who underestimated her, and clients whose lives hung on every objection she raised. There were nights she slept in her car after late hearings, mornings when the weight of injustice threatened to crush her resolve. But each victory, every wrongfully accused teenager released, every immigrant family kept together, hardened her will. She learned that the law could be both weapon and shield, and she vowed to master it so no one could wield it against her community unchecked. Her leap into politics was almost accidental. Local activists urged her to run for the Texas House after watching her dismantle an overzealous district attorney in court. At first, she hesitated. The glare of public office felt distant from the intimate grind of advocacy. But when she saw how legislation could either entrench inequality or dismantle it, she understood that the fight required a louder stage. In Austin, she quickly earned a reputation as a fearless interrogator and a voice for the overlooked. She championed police reform before it became a national headline, pushed for voting rights protections, and spoke bluntly about systemic racism even when colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Conservative pundits mocked her, but constituents, immigrant shop owners, black mothers, students marching for climate action packed her town halls, hungry for someone who spoke with both clarity and conviction. Her rise to Congress followed the same pattern. Improbable at first, inevitable in hindsight. Grassroots donations, many just a few dollars, powered her campaign. She knocked on doors until her sneakers wore thin, listening more than she spoke, gathering stories of struggle and hope from every block. When she was sworn in, she carried those voices with her, a living chorus that informed every question she would one day ask in the nation's capital. Even in Washington, where cynicism often smothers idealism, Jasmine's resolve only sharpened. She joined committees where the stakes were highest, civil rights, judicial oversight, knowing full well the storms she would face. Colleagues noted her composure, the way she could absorb a barrage of insults without flinching, the way she asked questions with surgical precision. Reporters compared her courtroom presence to that of the great orators of past movements, but those who knew her understood the source of that strength. It came from family, from history, from the unbroken line of people who had fought before her and demanded she carry the torch forward. Her identity was never a side note. It was the core of her public life. She spoke openly of being a black woman in halls built by enslaved labor, of representing immigrants whose accents still drew suspicion, of believing that diversity was not a buzzword, but the nation's lifeblood. When critics tried to weaponize her background, she met them with a calm smile and a sharper fact, turning their barbs into her own armor. By the time she walked into the hearing room that morning, Jasmine Crockett was more than a congresswoman. She was a culmination of generations who refused to be silenced, the embodiment of a promise America often made but rarely kept. She carried the steadiness of someone who has weathered storms and learned that dignity can be the most disarming force of all.
Observers noticed it as she took her seat. The quiet confidence, the unhurried movements, the subtle but unmistakable aura of someone prepared for a pivotal moment. While others fidgeted with papers and whispered about strategy, she simply breathed, eyes clear, posture poised. What they could not see, but what history would soon record, was the calculation unfolding behind that calm exterior. Every trial she had argued, every late-night conversation with her grandmother about courage, every constituent who begged her to fight for the voiceless, had led to this day. The question she was about to ask would not be shouted or dressed in theatrics. It would be simple, precise, and impossible to deflect. And when it landed, the chamber would feel the weight of generations pressing forward through her words, a force too powerful for even the highest court to ignore.
The chamber settled into a charged stillness as the exchange began, a silence so dense it seemed to vibrate against the marble walls. Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone with unhurried precision, the soft click echoing like a starting pistol. Across the table, Justice Brett Kavanaugh straightened his back and folded his hands, the picture of judicial poise, yet a faint twitch in his jaw betrayed the tension tightening beneath the surface. "Justice Kavanaugh," she began, voice low but carrying, "earlier you testified that precedent is the cornerstone of this court's legitimacy. Can you explain, then, why your recent opinions have repeatedly undercut long-standing decisions on voting rights?" Kavanaugh's lips curved into a controlled smile. "Congresswoman, each case must be evaluated on its own merits. The Constitution, she cut in gently, didn't change between those cases, did it?" The audience stirred, a faint rustle of fabric and breath. Kavanaugh blinked just once before continuing. "Interpretation evolves with circumstance. My colleagues and I, circumstance," Crockett leaned forward, eyes narrowing, "or ideology." A sharp inhale rippled through the gallery. A reporter lowered his pen, suddenly aware that something was shifting. The justice's polished calm began to fray. He clasped his hands tighter, knuckles whitening as a sheen of perspiration appeared at his temple. "I will not be drawn into political characterizations," he said, the practiced baritone a notch too loud. "And yet your decisions have drawn millions into courtrooms and polling stations. Families who wonder whether their voices still matter. Are they mistaken?" The gavel hovered in the chairperson's hand but did not fall. All eyes swung back to Kavanaugh. He exhaled slowly, a controlled release, but the corner of his mouth tightened. "The court interprets law, not public opinion. Interpretation without accountability is power without consent," Crockett countered, her tone sharpening like the edge of a blade. "Would you agree that democracy demands both?" A murmur swept the crowd, staffers leaning forward, spectators clutching armrests. Kavanaugh dabbed discreetly at his brow with a folded handkerchief. The overhead lights seemed hotter now, the room smaller. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the faint tremor in his fingers as he set the cloth aside. "I agree," he said finally, each word measured, "that the court serves the Constitution." "And the people?" she pressed. His pause stretched long enough for the tick of a wristwatch to sound like a drumbeat. "The Constitution embodies the will of the people," he answered, but the words lacked conviction, as though he could hear their hollowness as he spoke them. Crockett held his gaze, letting the silence work. Somewhere in the back row, a spectator coughed, the sound startling in its clarity. The tension drew everyone forward, journalists perched at the edge of their seats, aides whispering without taking their eyes off the front. "You've cited evolving circumstance to justify overturning protections generations fought to secure. Whose circumstances, Justice, are you truly serving?" The justice's jaw flexed. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The crowd leaned closer, a collective breath suspended. Even the air conditioning seemed falter. "I serve the law," he said at last, but the statement landed flat, an echo without weight. Crockett held his gaze, letting the silence work.
Somewhere in the back row, a spectator coughed, the sound startling in its clarity.
The pause stretched long enough for hearts to sync with the ticking of an unseen clock. Jasmine Crockett let the hush deepen, her eyes never leaving Brett Kavanaugh's. The committee room seemed to tilt toward her, every camera light a tiny star aimed at the same point. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper, carrying farther than a shout. "Justice Kavanaugh," she said, the syllables precise, "if the Constitution embodies the will of the people, why did you accept gifts and private trips from donors with active cases before your court and never disclose them?" The word slid into the room like a blade drawn slow. For a beat, no one moved. Then the sound of camera shutters erupted, a sudden storm of clicks and flashes. Reporters jolted upright, aides stiffened, eyes wide. Kavanaugh blinked. Once, twice. A single bead of sweat rolled from his temple to his collar. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, as though he'd inhaled the question and found it lodged like a stone. Crockett waited. Somewhere in the back, a spectator exhaled a shaky breath. A murmur rippled outward, the kind of low electric buzz that precedes an earthquake. The justice cleared his throat. "Congresswoman," he began, the baritone strained, these allegations—" She raised a hand, a subtle, commanding gesture that stilled the room. "It's not an allegation. It's a matter of public record. Private jet travel, luxury accommodations, repeatedly unreported. And every time the benefactors had business before your bench. How does that honor the will of the people you claim to serve?" The gavel in the chairperson's grasp twitched, but did not fall. The room belonged to her now. Kavanaugh shifted in his seat, the leather squeaking under his weight. "Those were personal." "Personal?" Her tone sliced through his attempt. "When a justice accepts favors from the powerful, the people have a right to ask whether justice is for sale." Flashbulbs flared, a staccato rhythm that punctuated each word. Audience members leaned so far forward it seemed the gallery might spill onto the floor. Kavanaugh inhaled, searching for the authority that had once carried him through confirmation battles and years of rulings. But his voice, when it came, lacked its usual iron. "I followed the guidance in place at the time." She tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile at the corner of her mouth, a signal to everyone watching that the foundation had cracked. "Guidance you chose not to strengthen when given the chance? Guidance that allowed you to hide gifts worth more than most Americans earn in a year? Tell me, Justice, is that interpretation or indulgence?" The gallery gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the air from the room. Kavanaugh's eyes flicked toward his counsel, but no lifeline waited there. Outside the chamber, the internet detonated. Within seconds, clips of the exchange flooded social media. On X, the hashtag #OneQuestion trended worldwide. A viral post read, "This is history unfolding. Crockett just put the Supreme Court on trial." TikTok erupted with split-screen reactions, students covering their mouths, lawyers nodding with grim satisfaction, grandmothers wiping tears of vindication. Cable networks broke into programming with urgent chyrons. Crockett confronts Kavanaugh over undisclosed gifts. Analysts scrambled to replay the footage, each frame dissected for every flicker of his expression. Back in the hearing room, Crockett's composure never wavered. "The American people deserve clarity," she said softly, her words carrying like a hymn. "Will you now, under oath, commit to full transparency of all gifts and travel received during your tenure?" Kavanaugh shifted again, a faint tremor in his hands as he gripped the edge of the table. The light seemed harsher now, magnifying every line of sweat on his brow. He swallowed. I will review the policies with my colleagues," he managed. "Policies are not a promise.
I'm asking for yours." Another silence, this one heavier than the first. The camera zoomed tighter, capturing the flicker of conflict in his eyes. Somewhere in the gallery, a phone chimed with a news alert. Already the outside world was reacting faster than the man at the center of it. Kavanaugh glanced toward the committee chair, but no rescue came. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, a man realizing the walls he'd built could not hold back the tide. "Yes," he said finally, barely audible, "I will disclose." The room erupted, not in cheers, but in the raw sound of history being marked. Gasps, hurried scribbles, the click of cameras capturing the moment the mighty bent. Crockett nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of victory without gloating. She gathered her papers with deliberate calm, letting the silence settle like dust after a storm. Outside, the digital roar intensified. Influencers posted instant memes. Kavanaugh, frozen mid-stammer, overlaid with the words, "Just one question." Late-night hosts drafted monologues before the hearing even adjourned. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. Hashtag justice for sale. Hashtag transparency now. Commentators on live streams marveled at the precision of her strike. One analyst said she didn't just ask a question, she exposed a culture of entitlement at the highest level. Back inside, the justice adjusted his robe as if to shield himself, but the gesture only underscored his vulnerability. The armor of confidence that had carried him through decades of power now looked thin, frayed by a single, undeniable truth. Crockett rose from her seat. "Thank you, Justice," she said, her tone as calm as she had begun. "The people will be watching." And with that, the hearing moved on, but the echo of her words lingered like a bell that refuses to stop ringing. The cameras followed her exit, capturing the quiet strength of a woman who had just shifted the ground beneath the nation's highest court. For millions across the country, it was more than political theater. It was proof that dignity, armed with facts and courage, could still humble even the most powerful. The question had been asked, the silence had spoken, and America would not forget. The nation, breathless and electrified, waited to see how far the shockwave would travel next.
Phones buzzed like a swarm of bees the instant Jasmine Crockett left the chamber. Within minutes, #OneQuestion shot to the top of trending lists across every platform, followed closely by #CrockettMicDrop and #JusticeForSale. Screens from New York to Nairobi lit up with the same looped clip, Crockett leaning forward, eyes steady, while Brett Kavanaugh froze beneath the weight of her question. On TikTok, reaction videos cascaded, college students clasping their cheeks in disbelief, seasoned lawyers grinning with hard-won satisfaction, immigrant mothers whispering to their children that truth can still win. Memes flooded timelines at a dizzying pace. One paired Kavanaugh's stunned expression with the caption, "When your receipt gets pulled at the supreme level." Another showed Crockett adjusting her papers beneath the words, "Queen of Accountability." Within an hour, late-night hosts had their opening monologues written. "I haven't seen a silence that awkward since my Wi-Fi went out mid-Zoom," joked one comedian, while another quipped, "Turns out the highest court isn't immune to the lowest question." Clips of the hearing became instant punchlines and rallying cries, equal parts entertainment and civic education. News outlets scrambled to keep up. Primetime anchors called it a constitutional thunderclap, while panelists debated whether the Justice Department should investigate. Progressive commentators hailed Crockett's precision. It wasn't just a question, it was a masterclass in how public servants should serve the public, a popular podcast host said. Conservative voices, meanwhile, tried to regain funding. Some dismissed the exchange as political theater. Others accused her of grandstanding. Yet even critics conceded the optics were devastating. It was a tough day for the court and an even tougher day for Justice Kavanaugh, a right-leaning strategist admitted on cable news. Statements from elected officials poured in. Members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus praised Crockett for defending the integrity of our democracy. Civil rights groups issued releases within hours calling her words a clarion call for transparency. Immigrant rights organizations highlighted her as proof that the children of outsiders could challenge the inner sanctums of power. She spoke for every family who ever felt invisible in the shadow of authority, one advocate tweeted, a post that racked up hundreds of thousands of likes before dawn. In small towns and big cities, watch parties and neighborhood meetings turned into impromptu discussions about ethics and accountability. Barbershops replayed the clip on loop. College debate teams analyzed her phrasing with the care usually reserved for Supreme Court opinions. Teachers slipped the moment into civics lessons the very next morning, presenting it as a living example of checks and balances at work. Financial markets didn't budge, but the cultural market trembled. Editorial boards that once tread carefully around judicial ethics now thundered for reform. Petitions demanding stricter disclosure rules for justices gathered millions of signatures in days. Polling firms reported a sharp uptick in public concern about Supreme Court transparency, a spike so steep analysts compared it to the aftermath of landmark scandals. Even pop culture joined the fray. A chart-topping rapper dropped a surprise verse referencing one question that shook the gavel, while a fashion brand released limited edition tea emblazoned with Crockett's now famous line, "Is justice for sale?" Sales sold out in hours, proceeds pledged to voting rights nonprofits. Through it all, Crockett remained composed, issuing a single statement that late evening. Accountability is not partisan. It is the promise we make to every American who believes in the rule of law. Her restraint only fueled admiration. Comment sections overflowed with comments like, "This is how you lead," and "Finally, someone fearless in that chamber." Meanwhile, the court stayed silent. No press release, no clarification, just a stone facade facing a public suddenly unafraid to question it. Legal scholars noted the irony, a body that demands transparency from others now confronted by its own opaque practices. The imbalance cannot hold, wrote one constitutional expert. This moment is a fulcrum. By weekend, the hearing wasn't more than a clip. It was a cultural tipping point. People who rarely followed politics now spoke with conviction about judicial ethics. High school students debated lifetime appointments. Immigrants and first-generation Americans shared stories of why Crockett's courage felt personal, proof that someone who looked like them could command the nation's attention and demand the truth. The aftershocks rippled outward. New bills proposed in Congress, town hall meetings packed beyond capacity, a fresh wave of young activists registering voters. Whether the Supreme Court changed remained uncertain, but something in the public had shifted. A single question had turned civic apathy into action, and the echo of that moment refused to fade. Across the country, people repeated the line that started it all, not as gossip, but as mantra, as rallying cry, as a quiet vow that power, no matter how cloaked, could still be called to account.
Morning sunlight spilled across the Capitol steps the next day, catching on the marble like a quiet benediction. Reporters waited for Representative Jasmine Crockett, but when she finally emerged, she offered no victory lap, only a calm statement that seemed to rise above the din. "Facts endure," she said, her voice carrying across the plaza, "and dignity outlasts fury." The words settled over the crowd like a promise, not a boast, a reminder that the real power of the previous night was never about humiliation, but about truth. Crockett spoke of the hearing not as a battle won, but as a responsibility honored. She thanked those who watched from living rooms and late-night buses, people who felt unseen by the highest court, yet refused to stop believing in justice. "The question I asked," she explained, "belongs to every American who wonders if the rules still protect them. I was only the microphone." Her humility contrasted sharply with the spectacle the nation had witnessed, and it reframed the confrontation as something larger than two individuals facing off across a table. Across social feeds and kitchen tables, that reframing took root. Teachers turned her words into classroom discussions about accountability. Faith leaders quoted her during Sunday sermons as an example of speaking truth without hate. Parents told their children that democracy is strongest when ordinary voices dare to demand answers.
The story became less about a single justice and more about a country rediscovering its civic heartbeat. In interviews later that week, Crockett emphasized that this moment was not about left or right, but about the shared covenant that binds a democracy. Justice and equality aren't partisan trophies. They're the foundation of the American promise. Immigrant families heard their own journeys echoed in that declaration, a recognition that belonging is not granted by power, but affirmed through courage. Longtime activists heard encouragement that years of quiet organizing still matter. Even skeptics, hardened by political cynicism, found it difficult to dismiss the clarity of her appeal. What lingered wasn't the flash of cameras or the trending hashtags, but the enduring lesson that accountability is an act of patriotism. Crockett's composure showed that conviction can be fierce without being cruel, that truth spoken calmly can pierce the loudest noise. In a time when outrage often feels like the only language left, she demonstrated another way: steadfast, rooted, unshakable. And in living rooms from rural towns to crowded cities, people absorbed that example. They began to see their own questions about fairness at work, about integrity in local government, about the rights of their neighbors as worthy of being asked. They felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that their voices carried weight. That is the quiet revolution a single moment can ignite. Because this was never only about a justice hesitating under bright lights, it was about the unbreakable thread running through the American story, the belief that every person has both the right and the duty to hold power to account. Facts endure, dignity outlasts fury, and the truth spoken clearly and fearlessly belongs to everyone. Crockett ended her remarks that morning with a simple charge. She urged, "Keep asking the hard questions. Your voice matters. Truth wins when we refuse to be silent." The crowd applauded, not as spectators, but as participants, recognizing themselves in her words. As the sun climbed higher, the plaza slowly emptied, but the echo of her message traveled on, into classrooms, into dinner conversations, into the next generation of citizens ready to speak up. In that resonance lay the real victory, a collective reminder that democracy is not a distant ideal, but a daily practice, sustained by the courage to stand, to ask, and to believe that justice is indeed for all.
The image of that silent chamber still lingers, the gavel suspended, the nation holding its breath, and one clear question cutting through the noise. You witnessed a moment when truth refused to be intimidated, when dignity proved louder than power. That headline you clicked, Jasmine Crockett exposes Judge Kavanaugh with just one question, was never just a tease. It was the turning point of a conversation our country has needed for far too long. But the story doesn't end here. The reason this clip matters isn't because a single justice stumbled. It's because millions of people like you felt the spark of accountability and possibility. Every comment you write, every share, every conversation you start keeps that spark alive. When you like this video, when you subscribe, you're not just following a channel. You're joining a movement that believes democracy belongs to all of us. So let your voice be part of this echo. Tell us what this moment meant to you. Share it with someone who thinks their voice doesn't count. Remind them that questions, simple, fearless questions, can shake the walls of the highest court in the land. Because when dignity speaks, history listens. And tonight, as you replay that single question and the silence that followed, remember, the next powerful truth might come from you.